Captain Sarah Mitchell had been the first woman to graduate Top Gun. She'd flown missions over Iraq and Afghanistan. Then she disappeared from the military overnight. For 8 years, she'd been hiding in plain sight as a flight attendant, until the day her past and present collided at cruising altitude, and 180 passengers' lives depended on skills she'd thought she'd left behind. Welcome to Forgotten Voices. Before we dive into this incredible tale of courage, identity, and the power of never forgetting who you really are, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from today, and if you believe that heroes can be hiding anywhere even serving. You coffee at 35,000 feet, hit that subscribe button. Sometimes the most extraordinary people are right in front of us, wearing the most ordinary uniforms. Flight 447 from Dallas to Miami was scheduled to depart at 2:15 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon. In October, Sarah Mitchell checked her watch as she walked through the jet bridge, her rolling suitcase trailing behind her with the practiced efficiency of someone who had made this same journey hundreds of times to the passengers already boarding. She looked exactly like what they expected to see: a professional flight attendant in her early 30s. Auburn hair pulled back in a regulation bun, makeup applied with precision. Wearing the navy blue uniform of Coastal Airlines, with its distinctive silver wings pin on her left lapel. What they couldn't see was the small scar above her right eyebrow, earned during a hard landing in a sandstorm outside Kandahar. They couldn't see the calcined phoenix tattooed in small letters behind her left ear, hidden by carefully arranged hair. And they definitely couldn't see the muscle memory in her hands as she automatically checked the cabin for anything that looked out of place, the same scan she'd once performed on F-16 cockpits before every mission. Sarah had been flying for Coastal Airlines for 8 years, 3 months, and 12 days. Before that, she had been Captain Sarah Mitchell, United States Air Force, the first woman to graduate from the Navy Fighter Weapons School, better known as Top Gun. She had logged over 2,000 flight hours in combat zones, flown 127 missions over Iraq and Afghanistan, and earned more commendations than most pilots see in a full career. Now she served beverages and demonstrated how to fasten seatbelts. The transformation hadn't been voluntary. As Sarah moved through the cabin, greeting passengers and checking overhead compartments, her trained eye automatically catalogued details. Business travelers typing on laptops, a family with 2 young children heading to Disney World, an elderly couple holding hands and sharing a crossword puzzle, a group of college students already planning their spring break adventure, 180 souls. She thought automatically, using the military terminology for passenger count that had never left her vocabulary. 180 people. Who would trust her to serve them drinks and keep them comfortable during their 3-hour flight to Miami? What they didn't know was that she was also keeping them safe in ways they couldn't imagine. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Flight 447 with service to Miami. Sarah announced over the intercom, her voice carrying the warm professionalism that had made her one of Coastal's most requested flight attendants. We're currently boarding all passengers, and we expect an on-time departure this afternoon. In the cockpit, Captain Robert Hayes and First Officer Michael Chen were running through their pre-flight checklist. Sarah had worked with both men before. Hayes was a 20-year veteran with a reputation for smooth landings and bad dad jokes, while Chen was newer to the airline but had quickly proven himself as a competent and careful pilot. Neither man knew that the flight attendant they worked with had more flight hours than both of them combined. Sarah had learned to hide that part of herself out of necessity. In her early days at Coastal, she'd made the mistake of offering technical suggestions about weather patterns and flight routes, drawing curious looks from pilots who wondered how a flight attendant knew so much about aviation. She'd quickly learned to keep her expertise to herself, to smile and nod when pilots explained things she already knew, to play the role that everyone expected her to play. It was safer that way. Safer for her carefully constructed new identity. Safer for the secrets she carried. Safer for the reasons she'd left the military that she still couldn't talk about. As the last passengers boarded and the cabin doors closed, Sarah moved through her safety demonstration with practiced ease, Point to the exits. Demonstrate the oxygen masks. Show how the life vest inflates. She'd done this routine so many times, she could perform it in her sleep. But she never let herself go through the motions carelessly. She'd seen too many emergency situations to ever take safety protocols lightly. Flight attendants, prepare for departure. Came Captain Hayes's voice over the intercom. Sarah secured her station and took her seat in the jump seat, automatically checking that her harness was properly fastened and her emergency equipment was within reach. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate and began its taxi to the runway, she found herself listening to the engine sounds with an ear trained to detect the slightest anomaly. Everything sounded normal. The Boeing 737 was a reliable aircraft, and this particular plane was only 3 years old with an excellent maintenance record. Captain Hayes had over 15,000 flight hours and an impeccable safety record. First Officer Chen was competent and careful. It should have been a routine flight, but Sarah had learned during her military career that routine flights had a way of becoming anything but routine, usually at the worst possible moment. Flight 447 took off smoothly, climbing through the scattered clouds over Texas and settling into its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. Sarah moved through the cabin, taking drink orders and chatting with passengers. She helped the family with young children get settled, brought extra napkins to the college students who had already spilled their sodas, and checked on the elderly couple to make sure they were comfortable. This was the part of the job she actually enjoyed. Not the serving drinks or the routine tasks, but the people. After years of flying military missions where human contact was limited and emotional connections were discouraged, she found genuine satisfaction in small acts of kindness that made someone's day a little better. "Excuse me," said a voice beside her as she worked her way through the cabin. Sarah turned to see a young woman, maybe 25, with nervous eyes and white knuckles gripping her armrest. "I'm sorry to bother you, but this is my first time flying and I'm really scared." Sarah immediately shifted into what she privately called her calm passenger mode, a combination of genuine empathy and professional reassurance that had taken years to perfect. "That's completely normal," Sarah said, crouching down to be at eye level with the nervous passenger. "What's your name?" "Jessica." "Hi Jessica, I'm Sarah. Can I tell you a secret? Flying is actually the safest form of travel. You're statistically safer up here than you were driving to the airport. Really, really. Our pilots have thousands of hours of experience. The aircraft is constantly monitored by air traffic control, and every system has multiple backups. We're in very good hands." Sarah spent the next 10 minutes explaining how airplanes worked, pointing out the normal sounds Jessica was hearing, and teaching her some breathing techniques to manage anxiety. By the time she moved on, Jessica was visibly more relaxed and even managing to smile. What Sarah didn't mention was that her knowledge of aircraft systems came from years of flying fighter jets, where understanding every component could mean the difference between completing a mission and becoming a casualty statistic. The first sign of trouble came. 90 minutes into the flight, Sarah was in the galley preparing the beverage service, when she heard Captain Hayes's voice over the intercom. But it sounded different, strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing some minor turbulence, so I'm going to ask everyone to return to their seats and fasten their seatbelts for a few minutes." But Sarah knew the difference between turbulence and something else. The aircraft was flying smoothly, no bumps, no irregular movement. This wasn't about weather. She immediately picked up the interphone to call the cockpit. "Captain Hayes, this is Sarah. Do you need any assistance up there?" There was a pause that lasted too long. Then, First Officer Chen's voice came through, tight with controlled panic. "Sarah, we need you in the cockpit immediately. Medical emergency." Sarah's blood went cold. She'd responded to medical emergencies before passengers having heart attacks, allergic reactions, panic attacks. But a medical emergency in the cockpit was different. That was crew, and crew medical emergencies could quickly become everyone's problem. She moved quickly, but calmly toward the front of the aircraft, stopping to speak quietly to Linda, the other flight attendant working the flight. "I need you to handle the cabin," Sarah said. "Keep everyone calm and seated. Don't let anyone know there's a problem in the cockpit." Linda nodded, recognizing the authority in Sarah's voice, even though they were technically equals in the airline. Hierarchy. Sarah used her key to open the cockpit door and immediately assessed the situation. Captain Hayes was slumped over the controls, unconscious, his skin pale and clammy. First Officer Chen was trying to monitor Hayes's vital signs while simultaneously flying the aircraft, an impossible task for one person. "What happened?" Sarah asked, immediately moving to help. "He just collapsed," Chen said, his voice tight with stress. Grabbed his chest, said he couldn't breathe, then passed out. "I think it's his heart." Sarah's military training kicked in automatically. In combat situations, you triaged, assessed the immediate threat, prioritize actions, execute with precision. The immediate threat wasn't Captain Hayes's medical condition. That was serious but stable for the moment. The immediate threat was an aircraft at 35,000 feet with only one Pontius pilot, who was rapidly becoming overwhelmed. "Michael," she said, using Chun's first name to establish personal connection and authority. "I need you to focus solely on flying. I'll handle Captain Hayes." "But, you're not medical." "I have emergency medical training," Sarah said. Which was true. All military pilots were required to have extensive medical training for situations exactly like this. And right now, keeping this aircraft stable is more important than anything else. Sarah quickly checked Hayes's pulse and breathing. His pulse was weak and irregular, his breathing shallow but steady. Definitely cardiac event, probably heart attack, but he was stable for now. She positioned him to keep his airway clear and began administering oxygen from the cockpit's emergency supply. But even as she worked on Hayes, her eyes were tracking the aircraft's instruments. Altitude steady at 35,000 feet. Airspeed, normal. Navigation systems functioning properly. Autopilot engaged and maintaining course. For now, everything was under control. But Chen was clearly struggling with the workload of single-pilot operations. While dealing with the stress of his captain's medical emergency, Michael, Sarah said calmly, "How much experience do you have with single-pilot emergency procedures?" "Not much," Chen admitted. "This is only my second year with Coastal. I've never had to handle a situation like this." Sarah made a decision that would change everything. "I need you to contact air traffic control," she said. "Declare a medical emergency and request priority routing to the nearest suitable airport. Tell them we need emergency medical standing by." "Already did that," Chen said. "They're vectoring us toward Jacksonville, Utah, about 40 minutes. 40 minutes. Sarah's mind ran through the calculations automatically. 40 minutes to get 180 passengers safely on the ground with an unconscious captain and a first officer who was rapidly approaching the limits of his experience and stress tolerance. She looked at the instrument panel, her eyes automatically reading the displays with the fluency of someone who had spent thousands of hours in similar cockpits. The Boeing 737 wasn't that different from the military aircraft she'd flown, more complex in some ways, simpler in others, but the fundamental principles were the same. "Sarah," Chen said, his voice cracking slightly, "I don't know if I can do this landing with emergency equipment and ATC priority and passengers who don't know what's happening, ... It's a lot." Sarah looked at the young first officer, seeing the fear and uncertainty in his eyes. She'd seen that look before, in the faces of young pilots facing their first combat mission, overwhelmed by the responsibility of lives in their hands. In those moments, she'd done what experienced pilots always did, stepped up and taken command. "Michael," she said quietly, "what if I told you that you don't have to do this alone?" "What do you mean?" Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to say would end 8 years of carefully constructed anonymity. "I mean, what if I told you that I'm qualified to help fly this aircraft?" Chen stared at her. "You're a flight attendant." "I'm also a pilot," Sarah said simply. "Military fighter pilot. I have over 2,000 hours of flight time, including emergency procedures and high-stress operations." The words hung in the air between them. Chen's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief to something approaching hope. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious. And right now, I'm offering to help you get these people home safely." Chen looked at her for a long moment, then at the unconscious captain, then at the complex array of instruments and controls that he was struggling to manage alone. "What do I need to do?" "First, slide over to the right seat," Sarah said, moving toward the captain's position. "I'll take the left seat and primary controls. You handle communications and systems monitoring. We do this together." As Chen moved to the first officer's seat, Sarah carefully moved Captain Hayes out of the pilot's position, securing him in the jump seat behind the cockpit where she could continue to monitor his condition. Then she settled into the captain's seat and placed her hands on the controls. For the first time in 8 years, Captain Sarah Phoenix Mitchell was flying again. The muscle memory was instantaneous. Her hands found the controls with automatic precision. Her eyes scanned the instruments in the pattern drilled into her through years of training. Her mind shifted into the focused calm that had carried her through combat missions over hostile territory. "Okay," she said, her voice taking on the controlled authority of a pilot in command. "Let's bring everyone home." She keyed the radio microphone. "Jacksonville approach. This is Coastal 447. Be advised, we have a change in crew configuration due to medical emergency. Requesting updated vectors for approach and emergency equipment. Standing by. Coastal 447 Jacksonville approach. Understand crew change. Confirm, you are declaring emergency." "Affirmative, Jacksonville. Medical emergency with 1 crew member. Request priority handling and emergency equipment. We have 180 souls on board, fuel for approximately 1 hour." "Roger, Coastal 447. You are cleared direct Jacksonville. Descend and maintain flight level 280. Emergency equipment will be standing by. Advise when ready for approach briefing." Sarah began the descent, her hands working the controls with the precision of someone who had performed similar procedures under much more challenging conditions. Beside her, Chen monitored systems and handled communications, visibly more relaxed now that he wasn't carrying the full weight of responsibility alone. "Sarah," he said, as they descended through 30,000 feet, "can I ask, what branch of military?" "Air Force, Navy fighter weapons, school graduate." Chen's eyes widened. "Top Gun, yeah. Jesus. And you've been working as a flight attendant." "Long story," Sarah said, making a course correction as Jacksonville approach vectored them around. "Weather. Let's focus on getting everyone down safely first." As they descended toward Jacksonville, Sarah found herself slipping back into the mental state that had once defined her. Total focus, absolute confidence, complete command of the aircraft and situation. It felt like putting on a familiar jacket that still fit perfectly despite years in storage. But she was also aware of the 180 passengers behind her who had no idea that their flight attendant was now flying the aircraft. She picked up the cabin interphone. "Linda, this is Sarah. I need you to make an announcement to the passengers. What do you want me to say?" Sarah thought carefully. The passengers needed to know something was happening, but panic would only make the situation more dangerous. "Tell them we have a minor medical situation with one of the crew members, so we're making an unscheduled stop in Jacksonville as a precaution. Tell them it's nothing to worry about, just being extra careful. Don't mention anything about changes in the cockpit crew." "Got it." A few minutes later, Linda's voice came over the cabin address system. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your flight attendant speaking. We have a minor medical situation with one of our crew members. So as a precaution, we're going to make an unscheduled stop in Jacksonville. This is purely precautionary, and there's no cause for concern. We expect to be on the ground in about 20 minutes, and we'll have more information for you once we're at the gate." Sarah monitored the passenger reaction through the cockpit doors window. Some looked concerned, others seemed annoyed about the delay, but no one appeared to be panicking. Good. Coastal 447, Jacksonville approach. You are number 1 for approach. Winds 090 at 15. Visibility 10 miles. Ceiling 2,500 broken. Runway 10 right in sight. Sarah looked ahead and saw the runway lights of Jacksonville International Airport spread. Out in the distance, Coastal 447 has the field in sight. Request vectors for visual approach runway 10 right. Coastal 447, cleared visual approach runway 10 right. Contact tower 119.1. 119.1, good day. Sarah switched frequencies. Jacksonville Tower, Coastal 447 with you. Visual approach runway 10 right. Coastal 447, Jacksonville Tower, cleared to land runway 10 right. Emergency equipment is standing by. As they approached the runway, Sarah could see the flashing lights of ambulances and fire trucks positioned along the taxiway. Standard procedure for any aircraft declaring a medical emergency, but the sight still sent a small chill through her. The approach was textbook perfect. Sarah had landed aircraft in much more challenging conditions: night landings on aircraft carriers in heavy seas, combat landings on makeshift runways under enemy fire, but she still felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with any critical phase of flight. Looking good, Chen said, monitoring their airspeed and descent rate. On glide path, on speed, Coastal 447, you are cleared to land. Emergency equipment is in position. Sarah touched down smoothly on runway 10 right, applied the brakes gradually to avoid jarring the passengers, and rolled out to a stop. As the aircraft came to a halt, she could see emergency vehicles surrounding them. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Jacksonville, Sarah announced over the intercom. Please remain seated while emergency medical personnel come aboard to assist. Our crew member will have you back on your way as soon as possible. Within minutes, paramedics were in the cockpit, taking over Captain Hayes' care and preparing him for transport to the hospital. The lead paramedic, a woman in her 40s, with the competent manner of someone who'd seen everything, looked at Sarah with curiosity. You the pilot who brought her down? Co-pilot, Sarah said, nodding toward Chen. Team effort. Nice job. That was a textbook emergency approach. As the paramedics wheeled Captain Hayes off the aircraft, Chen turned to Sarah with an expression of amazement and gratitude. I don't know how to thank you, he said. I was in way over my head back there. You saved everyone on this aircraft. We saved everyone, Sarah corrected. You did great under pressure, but the way you took control, the way you flew that approach. You weren't just helping, you were in command. Like you'd done it 1,000 times before. Sarah looked out the cockpit window at the emergency vehicles beginning to disperse, their flashing lights painting the tarmac in red and blue. In a few minutes, airline officials would board the aircraft to debrief the situation. There would be paperwork, interviews, probably media attention. Her carefully maintained anonymity was about to disappear. Sarah, Chen said quietly, why? Did you leave the military? You're obviously an incredible pilot. Why become a flight attendant? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, watching ground crews position equipment around the aircraft. Sometimes, she said finally, the thing you're best at is also the thing that breaks you. And sometimes you need to step away and figure out how to put yourself back together. But today, you came back. Today, people needed me to come back. Chen nodded, understanding more than Sarah had expected him to. For what it's worth, I'm glad you were here. Me too. An hour later, after Coastal Airlines had arranged for a replacement crew to fly the passengers to Miami, Sarah found herself in the airport's crew lounge, filling out incident reports and answering questions from company officials. The story was already starting to spread. Passengers' social media posts about the mystery pilot who had helped land the aircraft. Airline employees talking about the flight attendant who turned out to be a military pilot. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Linda, the other flight attendant. Girl, you need to check Twitter. You're famous. Sarah opened her social media app and saw dozens of posts with photos and videos from passengers on Flight 447. The story was already being picked up by aviation blogs and news outlets. Flight attendant reveals military pilot background during emergency landing. Her secret was out. Ms. Mitchell. A voice behind her made her turn. A woman in a business suit approached, extending her hand. I'm Rebecca Torres, Regional Operations Manager for Coastal Airlines. I wanted to personally thank you for your actions today. I was just doing my job, Sarah said. No, Torres replied firmly. You went far beyond your job description. You potentially saved 180 lives today. And I understand from the preliminary reports that you have extensive military flight experience. Some, Torres smiled. Ms. Mitchell, I've been in aviation for 20 years, and I know false modesty when I hear it. I also know that we have a pilot shortage and that finding experienced aviators is increasingly difficult. Sarah saw where this was going. Ma'am, I appreciate what you're saying, but I'm not looking to change careers. May I ask, why not? From what I witnessed today, you're clearly passionate about flying and exceptionally skilled at it. Sarah looked out the window at the aircraft parked at the gates, watched pilots and crew members moving through their routines, preparing for flights that would carry hundreds of thousands of passengers safely to their destinations. It's complicated, she said, finally. Most important things are, Torres replied. But consider this. Today you prove to yourself and everyone else that you still have what it takes. Maybe it's time to stop hiding from who you really are. That evening, Sarah sat in her hotel room in Jacksonville, scrolling through news coverage of the day's events. The story had been picked up by major news outlets, and her name, her real name, her military record, her Top Gun graduation was now public knowledge. Her phone rang constantly with calls from reporters, military friends she hadn't spoken to in years, and airline recruiters. She ignored most of them, but one call made her pause. Captain Mitchell. This is Colonel James Patterson, commanding officer of the 33rd Fighter Wing at Eglin Air Force Base. Sarah's blood ran cold. Military calls to former officers usually meant one of two things. They wanted something, or someone was in trouble. Colonel, she said carefully. Captain, I want you to know that the Air Force has been following your story today with great interest and considerable pride. What you did on that aircraft was exemplary and reflects the highest traditions of military service. Thank you, sir. I also want you to know that if you're ever interested in returning to active duty, or even serving in a reserve capacity, there would be opportunities available. We need experienced pilots, and we need leaders who can perform under pressure. Sarah closed her eyes. The military was offering her a way back, a return to the world she'd left behind 8 years ago. Sir, I appreciate the offer, but I left the service for reasons that haven't changed. Captain, those reasons were investigated thoroughly, and you were completely exonerated. The incident in Afghanistan was not your fault. You saved lives that day, just like you saved lives today. The incident in Afghanistan, Sarah's stomach clenched, as memories she'd spent 8 years trying to suppress came flooding back. The mission that had gone wrong, the choice she'd had to make, the investigation and the media attention, and the way everything she'd worked for had suddenly felt tainted. Sir, with respect, the investigation's conclusions don't change what happened. No, they don't. Colonel Patterson agreed. But they do prove that you made the right decision under impossible circumstances, just like you did today. After she hung up, Sarah sat in the darkness of her hotel room, thinking about the day's events and the choices that lay ahead of her. For 8 years, she'd been running from her past, hiding from the responsibility and the pressure and the weight of other people's lives in her hands. But today, when it mattered, she'd stepped up. She'd remembered who she was beneath the flight attendant uniform and the carefully constructed anonymity. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Jessica. The nervous first-time flyer. I saw the news. Thank you for keeping us safe today. You're my hero. Then another message from the elderly couple. Dear Sarah, we wanted you to know how grateful we are for your service. both today and in the military. You are the kind of person that makes WA proud to be Americans. And another, from one of the college students. Dude, you're like a real-life superhero. Thanks for getting us home safe. Message after message. From passengers who had been strangers 12 hours ago, but who now felt connected to her in a way that transcended the usual customer service relationship. Sarah realized that for the first time in 8 years, she felt proud of who she was again. The next morning, she called Rebecca Torres at Coastal Airlines. Ms. Torres, this is Sarah Mitchell. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday. I'm glad to hear from you, Sarah. What can I do for you? I want to know what it would take to transition from flight attendant to pilot with Coastal. There was a pause, then Torres's voice came, back with barely contained excitement. Sarah, let me ask you this. How soon can you start training? 6 months later, Captain Sarah Mitchell sat in the left seat of a Boeing 737. Preparing for takeoff from Dallas to Miami, the same route she'd once worked as a flight attendant, but this time, she was wearing pilot stripes instead of a flight attendant's uniform. And her name tag read Captain Mitchell instead of just Sarah. In the cabin behind her, passengers settled in for their flight, served by flight attendants, who moved through their routines with the same professional competence Sarah had once displayed. Some of the passengers probably remembered the story of Flight 447, but most were focused on their own journeys, trusting that the pilots would get them safely to their destination. First Officer Chen, now promoted after his excellent performance during the emergency, ran through the pre-flight checklist with the same meticulous attention to detail that had impressed Sarah during their crisis together. All systems nominal. Captain, he reported. Excellent. Request clearance for departure. Dallas ground, Coastal 447, ready for taxi. Coastal 447, taxi to runway 18, right via Alpha Bravo. As they taxied toward the runway, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her back to this seat. The 8 years of hiding, the moment of crisis that had forced her to remember who she really was, and the difficult process of rebuilding her identity and her confidence. She thought about Captain Hayes, who had made a full recovery and returned to flying after 3 months of cardiac rehabilitation. He'd sent her a handwritten thank you note that she kept in her flight bag. Thank you for being exactly who we needed. Exactly when we needed you. She thought about the passengers from Flight 447, many of whom had sent messages and letters over the months, sharing how her example had inspired them to pursue their own dreams and face their own fears. And she thought about the young women who had started approaching her at aviation events and career fairs, asking questions about becoming pilots and breaking barriers in what was still a male-dominated field. Coastal 447. Contact Tower 124.15. 124.15. Good day. Dallas Tower, Coastal 447, ready for departure. Coastal 447, runway 18 right. Cleared for takeoff. Sarah advanced the throttles and felt the familiar surge of acceleration as the aircraft began its takeoff roll. As they lifted off into the Texas sky, she smiled and keyed the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Welcome aboard Flight 447 with service to Miami. We're expecting a smooth flight today with arrival right on schedule. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the journey. But what she really wanted to say was, sometimes the most important journey is the one that brings you back to yourself. Sometimes heroes don't disappear, they just find new ways to serve. And sometimes the uniform doesn't make the person makes the uniform matter. As Flight 447 climbed toward cruising altitude, Captain Sarah Phoenix Mitchell was exactly where she belonged, in command, in control, and ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. Because some people are born to fly, and no matter how far they run or how long they hide, eventually, they always find their way back to the sky. So I ask you, have you ever walked away from something you were great at because it became too hard, too painful, or too complicated? Have you ever hidden your talents because you were afraid of the responsibility that came with them? Captain Sarah Mitchell spent 8 years running from her calling, convinced that her past mistakes had disqualified her from the cockpit. But when 180 people needed her skills, she remembered that sometimes our greatest failures teach us how to handle our greatest successes. Heroes don't always announce themselves with fanfare. Sometimes they're serving you coffee. Sometimes they're checking your seatbelt. Sometimes they're doing ordinary jobs while carrying extraordinary skills, waiting for the moment when the world needs them to remember who they really are. Share this story if you believe in second chances. If you've ever needed time to heal and grow, or if you think everyone deserves the opportunity to find their way back to their purpose. Because the next time you interact with someone in what seems like an ordinary job, remember you might be talking to someone whose hands once controlled million-dollar aircraft, whose mind once made life or death decisions, whose heart once soared above the clouds. Thank you for watching Forgotten Voices. Subscribe to honor those who serve in all forms. And remember, sometimes the sky calls us back when we're finally ready to answer. Heroes don't retire. They just change uniforms.